Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today in my presentation on change management. I want to acknowledge that Saskatchewan Polytechnic operates on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. My name is Kim Jasken. I'm an online curriculum developer at Saskatchewan Polytechnic. I use Brightspace pretty much every single day. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science, I have a master's degree in educational technology and design, and I am an author of a new book called My Daughter's Heart. I'm from Canada. I grew up and still live in Saskatchewan. For those of you that live in the States, I'm just above Montana and North Dakota. I would also like to introduce you to my family today. This is Sage on the far left holding our dog Coda. Sage is currently 17, and then you see me and my youngest daughter Sierra, who's currently 14 in the red, and my husband Scott in the back. In my presentation, I'm going to share with you a personal story of change, which is why I introduced you to my family. And through that story, you will understand the purpose and importance of using proper change management. Change management is a structured process to leading the people side of change. Through this presentation, I'm going to make reference to two change models, the AdCar change model and the Lewin's change model. If you're not familiar with either of these, that's okay. I'm going to do a really brief overview of both. So here's the AdCar model. It follows the acronym that spells out AdCar. So each letter I'll go over super quick. So A stands for awareness, and this is the starting point. This is where you recognize that a change needs to occur. So there's either a problem with the current way of doing things or a new opportunity arises. Whatever it is, you need to be aware of the change before anything can happen. D stands for desire. So it's not enough to know that the change exists or that an opportunity for change exists, but you need to want the change to occur. So you might evaluate potential changes, but maybe they're not a good fit. So you need to want it to happen. So there is a real important part that lies here in the desire step. It's often missed, or there's not enough time spent on this, but this is where you sort of gather the buy-in from everybody that's going to be involved in the change. So K stands for knowledge. So those involved need to know what is required to make the change. They need to have the knowledge of the new processes or the new ways of doing things. And then A is for ability. Knowing what to do is one thing, but having the ability to do them is a deeper aspect. So the ability phase, this is where people involved get to practice and demonstrate their skills. If there's training involved, that happens in the ability phase. And then finally, R is reinforcement. This is after the change has occurred and everybody is doing the new processes or the new things or using the new technology. They need to know in the reinforcement stage that they are being successful, because it's often easy to revert back to old ways of doing things, so we need to reinforce them as we go. So that's the AdCar change model, and I know that was quick, so if this is new to you, that's okay. I'll return to the acronym as we go through it. And here's the Lewin's change model. So this one's more simplistic. We've got three identified phases. We have unfreeze, change, and refreeze. So unfreeze is the idea of unlearning the way you used to do things. I mean, I know you don't technically unlearn something, but sort of forget about the way that you used to do things. And then change is where the actual change occurs. And then refreeze happens after you've been used to doing the new processes or using the new technology. You're going to refreeze this new way of doing things into your brain. So those are the two change models. So here's my story. It all started on May 12th in 2020. COVID was a thing. For us, schools were canceled and we were just getting used to living life at home. My husband and I had transitioned to working from home. So one evening, my husband and I were sitting in the backyard and the kids were at home in the house making TikToks, as they did. And my older daughter, Sage, she comes out to the backyard, she opens the door and she's like, you know, there's something wrong with Sierra. We went to grab an orange juice out of the fridge and And Sierra grabbed it, and then she dropped it. She picked it up, and she dropped it. And she picked it up, and she dropped it a third time. She just couldn't hold on to it. And we were talking, and her words all of a sudden just sounded like gibberish, and they just didn't make any sense anymore. And then we went to go walk back down the stairs, and Sierra just grabbed onto the hand railing and fell to the ground. Oh, I looked at my husband and hopped out of the hot tub and ran into the house to see what was going on. And Sierra was conscious, although lying flat on the floor on her back. And I ran over to her and I put her head in my lap and I asked if she was okay. And she was. She wasn't in any pain and she could talk, but as soon as she started telling me what happened, her eyes filled with tears because she knew something had happened. She knew something weird had happened, but she didn't know what it was, right? She couldn't pinpoint it. So I called 911 and the ambulance came and took us to the hospital. So here's Sierra in the hospital. You can tell she actually feels pretty good. It took the doctors a couple days to figure out what was going on, but they determined she had a very weak heart. They actually found a blood clot in her heart because of its weakening. So their plan was to try and solve the problem with meds. They wanted to, I don't know, give her some sort of meds that would hopefully strengthen her heart. And in addition to that, they were giving her blood thinners to try and shrink the clot. But they had to keep a really close eye on her because if that clot, when it shrinks, if it happened to dislodge, they didn't want it to move to her brain because that would cause a stroke. So they sent her to the pediatric intensive care unit. And I was with her, so only one parent, because it was COVID, so only one parent was allowed to go with her. So I went with her and stayed with her, slept there, everything. And they just kept her under close eye, and they kept coming in and doing tests and trying to see the state of where she was at. So this one time, so she was having an echocardiogram, and an echo it's the same technology that they use for an ultrasound, except they were using it to look on the inside of her chest so they could see her heart and figure out what was going on there. So the doctors came in and said, oh, we're going to do another one of these echoes. And they were trying to explain, you know, the various plans that they could go through. So they said that they were going to try and fix her with meds and, you know, but if that didn't work, they said, we can always ship her to Edmonton. You know, we don't have all the expertise here, but in Edmonton, they can do amazing things. They have these cool devices that they can implant into kids' hearts now, and it helps them pump. Or they said they can do heart transplants there. They said Edmonton has all these great things. So, but we lived in Saskatoon, so we were in the hospital in Saskatoon. So anyways, the echotechnologist came in and hooked her up to the machine, and I was sitting right beside Sierra on the bed here. And I was chatting with the echotech. We had a number of these done already, and the echocardiogram took about 45 minutes, so I was just sitting there chatting with her. And Sierra would always get bored as I would chit-chat with whatever nurse or whoever was in the room. So Sierra wasn't paying attention. She was just watching the TV overhead. Anyway, so the echo tech was showing me everything that she can see on the computer screen and whatnot. And then Sierra kind of flinched. She flinched really weird. And I didn't know what had happened. If maybe she got startled by something, or if something hurt all of a sudden, which it shouldn't because the echo doesn't hurt. But she flinched really weird, and the echo tech saw it as well. And then she flinched again. And it was just a really weird sort of jolting motion that she was suddenly making. And then the echo tech had called her name. She's like, Sierra, Sierra. And Sierra didn't respond. So the echo tech called into the hallway. She said, help, we need help in here. So doctors and nurses and people just came flooding into her hospital room, and I just stood up and I let them hover and do their thing. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there as if I was watching a movie. And the doctor had said to me, we think she's having a stroke. So we need to take her down for an emergency CT scan, and that will confirm if that is in fact what's happening, and if so, we will take her for an emergency embolectomy. And that's what they did. So they whisked Sierra out of the room and did both the CT scan to confirm that she was having a stroke, and then they took her in for an emergency embolectomy, which is quite an amazing procedure. They go in through your groin and pull out the clot out of your brain. It's incredible. Anyways, they returned Sierra to the room, And this is what she looked like. So this picture is literally just hours after the previous one. So the doctors explained that she's sedated and they can't wake her up without a plan because what they're doing is not working. So little did I know that the doctor had already started to plant the seed. He had previously started building awareness of potential outcomes. Remember earlier, I had a conversation with the doctor and he said, oh, the doctors and specialists in Edmonton, well, they can do amazing things. Well, sure enough, that was the new plan. So later that day, they loaded Sierra and me on a plane and off to the Stollery Hospital we went. So here we are. They're loading us up on the plane. Sierra's still sedated. I got to go with her, thank goodness. My husband and Sage, they drove out to Edmonton. It's about a 6-hour drive from Saskatoon, so they eventually met us there. We beat them, of course. But when we landed in Edmonton at the Stollery Hospital, we were met by a team of pediatric cardiologists, and they had their own pediatric cardiology unit, so that was pretty cool. But what first happened was the doctors there reassessed the situation. So they had already talked to the doctors from Saskatoon and gathered as much information from them as they could. And then they asked me in detail. They asked me to tell them everything that had happened from the beginning pretty much until we got there. And they didn't just listen, but they actively listened. So they gathered all this information. And then finally they checked her out themselves. She was still sedated when they arrived, so they checked her vitals and checked her out like that. And then they lightened the sedation and woke her up. So days passed, and they also tried various meds. They had about the same success as the doctors did in Saskatoon. They couldn't strengthen her heart with meds. But what they did do is they sat us down and they presented us with their best recommendations. So they had said, ideally, they would like to do a heart transplant. But there are so many variables involved, including an unknown timeline. They don't know when they'll be able to get a heart that matches what Sierra needs. So the best interim solution that they recommended was to implant a VAD, or LVAD as it's called. VAD stands for ventricular assist device. And then they continued to tell us why the VAD was the best solution for the time being. So they were still building on the awareness because all of this stuff was very new to us, but they were also starting to see that desire. They were almost selling it to us like, this is why we should do this. And rightfully so. So they explained that this would, they'd implant the VAD and that it would help pump the blood through the body so her body could get strong again, so that when a heart does come in, that her body can receive it well and she can recover from it well. So it was all about the awareness, but also building the desire. Like, they really needed us to get on board with this and be okay with what was happening. And they did. Like, we agreed that the VAD was the correct course of action. But this was after many conversations. They weren't just like, hey, this is what we were going to do. They sat with us and explained to us until we understood why this was the best course of action. So did we want to participate in this change? No, of course we didn't. But we understood that it was the best thing for our daughter. So the next step was to prepare us for the change. So they were fully transparent on everything that we were to expect, but in small doses, right? They didn't bombard us with all of the information at once. They gave us pieces of information and then they built on it. So for starters, they brought in the device and showed us how it worked. So here's an image that I borrowed from the internet, just to show you that the device connects to the heart. So internally, you can see that it's connected there to the heart, and then the cable, if you want to call it, extends from the device and it actually exits out of a hole next to her belly button, like in her abdomen. So then the piece at the bottom, that computer piece, that is the controller, and it in fact controls the device, and then it's connected to two battery packs, which is what you see sitting on each side of this image. Is like those are holsters and the batteries are in those holsters. So they showed us, they didn't just show us a picture, they actually brought in the device and showed us what it looked like, just so we could be familiar with it, so that we had the knowledge of what it was that they were essentially going to implant into our daughter. So they told us all of the surrounding things too. They discussed that we'd have a very strict medication routine, including her blood consistency. Like we had to keep her blood consistency at a certain level, so we would have frequent lab work. I mentioned that this device exits out a hole in her abdomen, so Scott and I would have to learn how to do sterile dressing changes because we would have to keep the area clean and covered at all times. And we had zero medical background. We're both, work on computers all day, know nothing about the medical field. So this was a big learning curve for us. But they told us all of those things that we would need to do. The device runs on batteries, so we would have to keep the batteries charged. At night, we would literally have to plug Sierra into the wall. So there was a lot of stuff and a lot of stress. There were a lot of tears, don't get me wrong. But because they gained our trust and our buy-in, we knew that we had to push through this. So this was like the knowledge part of the AdCar process, right? Like they were sharing the knowledge. We didn't know how to do the things yet, but we knew what was all involved. So let's have a look at the Lewin's change model, right? Remember at the beginning I introduced this one too. Well, the current point that we were at is we were starting to unfreeze our current ways of doing things, right? Or unlearning our current modes of life, really. So the next part after, unlearning our current way of doing things is this change had to occur. So we didn't make the change, the surgeons made the change, right? By implanting the VAD, that was the change that had to occur. So they made the change. It was a lengthy surgery and recovery was, hard, but she endured and made it through. And here's some photos of her in recovery. So you can see there on the left, she's starting to regain some strength and she's walking again. And then the photo in the middle, that's the device. You can see it's coming out from under her shirt and you can see the two batteries and the controller sitting on the bed. And then the last photo there, that's, where the big bandage on her stomach, that's where it's coming out, where the drive line there is coming out of her abdomen. So these are just some pictures to show that after a rather hard recovery, things did get better. So in terms of doing our new things of, doing the meds and working with the VAD and understanding what the different numbers on the controller meant and charging the batteries and plugging her in and all those sort of things. At first, the doctors and nurses did all of that stuff and we just watched, right? But then because it was so routine and we watched, when we got a little more comfortable and Sierra was less frail, then my husband and I started to do these things with them. They didn't just tell us what to do and let us have at her. We did it with them and they supervised us and we had many, many conversations, right? The medical staff truly made us feel like there were no stupid questions. And trust me, we had a lot of stupid questions, but it was okay because it was so open and honest. There was just so much communication. Like we talked with the doctors and nurses, we laughed, we cried, we were so vulnerable and they were so human and understood that we were going through a really hard time. And change is really hard, right? Whether it's something as significant as this or even if it's just doing new processes at work or implementing a new system. Like, change is hard, and we need to be able to communicate openly about change and to not feel stupid saying, oh, hey, this is what happened, or this is what I did, or, you just need to have that trust and that buy-in to know that this change is the best way to do things. So eventually we did these steps all supervised, and then we did them on our own, right? There came a point where we were comfortable doing the dressing changes and charging the batteries and understanding what the numbers on the controller meant. And we actually did some quite formal training when it came to the VAD, because we needed to know how to respond to certain emergency situations. Like if the VAD went, like if something happened to it, we needed to know how to switch out the controller or how to respond to certain beeps and alarms that might happen. So we had formal training on how to do this stuff, and we even had to write a test in the end. So that was the ability phase of our change model, of our AdCar model, right? So at first, they just told us what had to be done, and then throughout the next couple of months, we learned by doing what had to be done, and we had documentation to help us when we were doing it on our own. And then, like I said, we had to write a test, and if we didn't successfully complete the test, we couldn't leave that particular ward alone with Sierra. We needed to pass that test before we were allowed to even wander the hallways of the hospital unescorted. So we did have a pretty, substantial ability portion of the change model. So if we're looking at the Lewin's change model, we're still in this process of change, right? So we're learning how to do the new things, so we're still all encompassed in change. Now, after this, we move on to the reinforcement side of our change model. And what the reinforcement part really includes is milestones and acknowledgements that exist to ensure that you're doing the right thing, because they really need to solidify what you're doing. So in our situation, milestones were baked into our progress, right? If once we passed our test, we were allowed to leave the ward with Sierra. So that was a great success, right? That was acknowledgement all on its own. But there were other things too. So we had to learn how to do that sterile dressing change. And once we learned how to do that, we could actually get a day pass or a weekend pass to leave the hospital. So we had a lot of incentives that just fell into our situation. But incentives are a great way to establish that reinforcement, right? Like if you continue to do this thing for a certain amount of time, then you get a virtual, I don't know, medal or something, or, just an acknowledgement to say, hey, like this stuff has been hard and it's been going really well. Please keep it up. Thank you for all of your work. And, just some pieces or acknowledgements baked in so that people that are doing the change know that what they're doing is good and it's valuable. So in the Lewin's change model, this would be the whole refreeze part, right? So this is the new way of doing things. This was our new lives. Our new lives were plugging Sierra into the wall when she went to bed at night. So things were going okay for us. Actually, no, they weren't. They were not great. They were pretty hard. Sierra was having some pretty big issues. The main one was she kept getting infections. So after we learned how to do everything ourselves, we did get discharged from the hospital, but she got readmitted because of infection. And this happened a number of times. So they would fill her full of IV antibiotics in hopes to clear the infection, and then they'd send us home again, and then, you know, her infection markers would be elevated again, so they'd readmit her. So it was a little bit of a vicious cycle. So when we were discharged, we had to still stay within the Edmonton area. So we were on our own, but we weren't completely without support, right? So we had rented an Airbnb in Edmonton, and we'd uprooted our lives from, you know, our home in Saskatoon, and we were living in Edmonton so that we could be close to the hospitals, and because they didn't have trained specialists in Saskatoon to deal with our situation. So the hospital staff made sure that we were, you know, within close proximity. And it was a good thing because we did kept getting readmitted into the hospital. So anyways, the doctors couldn't seem to eliminate all of the infections. They even did a small procedure, like they went inside and kind of scraped away some of the infection, because what they were worried was that the infection would move up the driveline, and the driveline was connected to her heart. So if an infection moved upwards, that would obviously not be good. So anyways, things were not great. We were back in the hospital. When we were in the hospital and when I would stay with her, there's always two beds. Like she would be in a bed, and then like 4 feet from her, there'd be like a little bed for the parent, because she was only 11 at the time. So, you know, she didn't have to stay alone. Anyways, it was after Christmas by now. So this whole thing started in May, and now we're after Christmas. Christmas has passed, and we were readmitted, and we're in the hospital, and we're sleeping this one night, and my phone rang. It was actually just after midnight, and Sierra was asleep. She didn't even hear my phone, and it didn't worry me or panic me when the phone rang because I was literally 4 feet away from Sierra, so I could see her there, and I knew that she was okay. Anyways, it was the doctor on the other side of the phone, and you know what he said? He said, "We have a heart." So essentially, the whole change management process started all over again, right? That new piece of knowledge that we had learned and reinforced and refroze into our brains was all of a sudden going to change again. It's inevitable. The only thing constant in life, as they say, is change, right? So that's what we did. I mean, change is a part of life. It's in every industry, in probably like in so many situations, right? And change can be really hard, not only in this situation, but in our work lives, and you know, change can be hard. So change management simply acknowledges that it's difficult, and it tries to put some structure and process around making change easier for the humans. So to summarize, we looked at the AdCar model and the Lewin's model, and we compared my story, and we looked at how change was supported. So there are other effective change models out there as well. These are just two that I used because I like them, they're familiar, and they're simplistic to follow. So change models guide you to be just more strategic about the change process. But one thing that extremely helps in any change management process is just loads of communication. The more you can talk out those fears, the less fearful they become. The more that you feel like that there's trust between the participants, the better the change is going to go, the more smoothly it's going to run, right? You just need to be able to talk openly and honestly and really support one another. That's change management is about communication and support. That's the whole purpose of it. And through that, hopefully you will have a successful change. So thank you all for listening to my story. In case you're curious, Sierra's heart transplant was successful. It's been over 2 years now, and she's healthy and happy, and we are grateful for each and every day. If you're interested, like I mentioned at the beginning, I recently wrote a book about my story, or about our story. So this is the cover of the book. It's called My Daughter's Heart by Kim Jaskin. It's available online. It's on Amazon. So please, I would love if you checked it out. Or if you want to reach out to me directly, there's my email address there, jaskink@saskpolytech.ca. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope you remember this story the next time you've got a big change and you're at work and you know that a big change is going to happen. Remember to support the human and be communicative and use one of those change models or find a different one that you like. So thank you so much for listening. Take care.